Most people tend to assume that J.R.R. Tolkien was risk-averse to the more sinister sides of morality and depravity in his stories about the struggles and wars of Middle-earth, preferring instead, much to many modern readers' and scholars' disapproval, stories of princesses and towers and heroes and swords. But specifically in this case, I am referring to assault and how Tolkien deals with this. This is the most disturbing and, I think, avoided topic by fans, scholars, and even, from what I found, a lot of Tolkien YouTube channels. Too obviously politically loaded and arguably too emotional to do justice to the topic properly. And by emotional, no, I do not mean feminine. Quite honestly, if you are just a movie fan or even just read the Lord of the Rings books or the Hobbit book, you'd be forgiven for just how dark Tolkien can actually go. This is an area for J.R.R. Martin rather than it is for Tolkien, who writes about, as one person told me, elves and little people. And this perception has bothered some feminist scholars as well, as if women's sexuality and their struggles during these times and portrayals were being sidelined and glossed over for some cleaner princess stories, as I said earlier. However, I'm going to explore how Tolkien did explore the topic of assault in his stories through these specific characters. Aerin the Maya, Lúthien, Turin Turambar and his sister Nienor, Aerin, I believe is how it's pronounced, and the women of lomin, and Aredhel. And this is to show how the topic is a lot more nuanced, while at the same time being very clear-cut morally when it comes to how Tolkien makes his case about it in his books and writings. And mind you, some of these will depend on which text you happen to read, because a lot of these interpretations did not make it into the published accounts, such as the Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings. That being said, let's get started. To understand Tolkien's treatment of assault, you have to understand his view of evil, a progressive fall that is inevitable in most cases, as according to his beliefs. The descent into depravity, the deeper one sinks into corruption. And nowhere was there bigger poster boy for this than Melkor, who starts out early during the creation of the sun and moon. Now, in the published Silmarillion, Aerin, the Maya, is the one who guides the sun, and is addressed as a Maiar of the female persuasion, as well as being one of the spirits of fire. Or in other words, yes, she is related to the Balrogs. I'm not sure if I'd call her a Balrog, but whatever. But she is also one of those spirits of fire who did not kowtow to Melkor when he seduced the rest of them. And therefore, she is so powerful that Morgoth now fears her. However, we get a different take on this in Morgoth's Ring, where Tolkien kind of presents two different versions of this. In these versions that got cut, Melkor wanted to marry Aerin, but she rejected him, and he either assaulted her or attempted to assault her, causing her to flee for a time after she torched his ass. This didn't make the final cut, as I said, but Tolkien did write about it, and it's up to the reader whether they want to regard this as canon or not. But it does tell us something crucial moving forward with this. 1. Tolkien never portrayed assault as anything but depraved and disgusting and morally absolute. And that Aerin was not a passive maiden. She is quite literally fire itself, and she responds with fire and retaliatory violence in all versions of Morgoth's attacks. This is a female spirit who does not take shit from unwanted advances lying down. Second is Aredhel, who is one of the Noldor royal family. Aredhel's story is one of the most debated in the entire Legendarium. I've already done an extensive video on her where I go more into detail about this, but here are the essentials. That she was a rebellious punk elf princess who often hung out with her uncle Feanor's side of the family much to her own family's dismay. After being told by her brother Turgon that she cannot see them, she does so anyway and ends up lost in the woods of the Sindar elf Aerin. That then ends up in a marriage and a son. This story has always been one of the most open-ended and lingering mysteries in the published Silmarillion, because it begs these questions. Was Aredhel assaulted by Aerin, physically or mentally? Or did she consent to the marriage, as the story implies when it says, not being wholly against it? Tolkien apparently had initially written this out to be the former, and then decided to change it, deciding that among elves, assault was considered extremely taboo and not done. However, the circumstances were left ambiguous enough to make readers uncomfortable, and that's entirely the point. I personally reasoned that of Tolkien's later reasons, and as well as what the elf Coercion says to Aerin later on, that it was already within Aredhel's character to do something just for the sake of doing it, like dating a bad boy, as it were, because she already has a long track record of doing this behavior going all the way back to Valinor. So it's not out of character. But even if Tolkien softened the original draft by saying this, the question of non-consent remains hanging in the air, as well as manipulation. And that's intentional. Aredhel is an empowered and rebellious spirit, but even rebellious spirits can be manipulated. Next case is Lúthien. In the published Silmarillion, Lúthien uses her power to lull Morgoth and everyone in his hall to sleep, and that Morgoth became so enchanted by her power that he began to have, quote-unquote, a design so dark than any that had come into his heart since he fled Valinor. He basically is now lusting after the daughter of Thingol and Melian. Avala is lusting sexually after Amaya, before Lúthien's power finally overtakes him. Tolkien describes Lúthien as the most beautiful woman to have ever existed in Middle-earth, and it's more than implied that others wanting her wasn't something entirely new to her either. She was essentially the high school princess, if you will, of Beleriand. And once again here we have Tolkien describing that even the thought of assault is something so disgusting it didn't bear worth mentioning details. Tolkien refuses to sanitize this. He refuses to sensationalize it. He refuses to describe it. He simply shows how evil desires corrupt the heart of the greatest villain in Arda. Lúthien herself was empowered enough to not only allow only those she trusted and loved close to her, but that this was a woman who knew what she wanted, what she believed, and was empowered enough to pursue it. The next case is a lot more tragic and the one that touches the most on the real world, unfortunately. And that is what happens to the women of Dor Lomin. And this is where Tolkien is at his most brutal and explicit. After the Nernaeth Arnodiad War, Morgoth gives the land of Dor Lomin to the Easterlings, and with no men or armies left to defend them, Tolkien writes that the women of the land were, quote-unquote, taken by force by the conquerors. And as one Redditor put it so well, this is Tolkien speak for assault. Let me be quite frank here. There is no denying, no rationalizing around that this was not only a clear case of assault, but on a massive scale. Think what the Russians did when they conquered Berlin in 1945 and its aftermath, and you get the idea. And yeah, this is the same guy who wrote about hobbits and singing elves, by the way. The experience that I'm going to talk about is embodied by three women in particular: Aerin, Morwen, and Nienor. Aerin is beaten for helping Turin and his family by her Easterling husband. So let's add abuse to that list as well. When Turin then kills her abusive husband, Aerin is so brutalized by her experiences that she chastises Turin as, quote-unquote, bringing death to her, implying that any case of self-defense from any of the women of Dor Lomin was a death sentence by the Easterlings. Morwen avoids this fate only because the Easterlings fear her by her own aura farming, as it were, that she is so intimidating that the Easterlings don't fuck with her, considering her to be a witch. However, her daughter Nienor was a different story, because as she matures, she gets more beautiful and starts getting the attention of the Easterling colonizers. Out of fear that they will eventually overcome their fear of her, Morwen, who had been absolutely refusing to leave Dor lomin up till now, decides that she has no choice in order to protect her family, and migrates to Doriath, where her son, Hurin, had been sent earlier and they had been in constant communications with. This is Tolkien confronting the reality of war. The book of the Children of Húrin not only shows how evil assault is, but also the aftermath of its effects on its victims. That even a small amount of kindness can result in ingratitude or death, and it becomes almost understandable why the women of Dor lomin would simply just want to keep their heads down. This next case involves Tolkien's most explicit statements on sexual violence, from another point of view. Turambar, on the run, comes across a woman who is fleeing from other members of a group of outlaws called the Wraith, in particular, Forweg and Androg. Hurin kills Forweg, whom he finds out later that he was the leader of the group. The woman whom he saves demands that he do the same to Androg, but Hurin refuses instead, and allows her to go home, and then demands Androg to explain why the hell he's hunting down this hapless woman, in which case Androg simply replies, "Outlaws know no laws but their own needs." I did a video on this as well, and the same applies. This is one of Tolkien's most explicit published statements on assault. And what makes this even more disturbing than Aerin's story is that we get the perspective of the person doing the assault, the why. And their reasoning, if you want to call it that even, is so base and depraved that it still sends chills up my spine even as I'm doing this video. This is Tolkien showing the predator mindset. It's not glamorized, it's not justified, it's not poeticized, it's not pushing any kind of character development whatsoever. It's just raw depravity, and it's as raw as it is disgusting. And we are meant to feel that way about it when we read those words. In the final case, we actually go to a different part of the Silmarillion, the Akilabeth, in which in this case we deal with the last queen of Numenor, Silmaril. Now, according to this account, she was by legal right the next ruler of Numenor, but Ar-Pharazôn, the leader of the rebellious faction of the Númenóreans, and for that matter the majority of Númenóreans as well, that sought to gain immortality and more power, the book says, quote unquote, took her to wife against her will, doing great evil. Again, we're dealing with Tolkien phrasing here, and it's a long-held opinion by fans and scholars that this was another Tolkienese way of saying that Miriel was assaulted. This is the corruption of Numenor, which we've been hearing about for many passages for now in kind of general and larger terms, now made much more personal. After that, Miriel is no longer mentioned until the downfall of Numenor itself when it's destroyed, as she tries to appease Uru by ascending the Holy Mountain, but by now it's far too late, and she's basically crushed against the mountain by a giant-ass wave. What makes Silmaril's story so disturbing is that the implied powerlessness of her position. That Numenor was so corrupt and depraved by this time that even the rulers themselves were no longer safe, and could be made to be forced to comply. No one was left to help her, or guard her rule against usurpers. Moreover, unlike the case of Aredhel and Aeol, Tolkien doesn't give any earlier or current definitions of what against her will doing evil actually meant. This is left essentially up to the reader's imagination. And honestly, I don't know how the show The Rings of Power is going to handle this. Good luck with that shit. But, again, it's a long-held opinion that this was a case where Miriel was assaulted. So in conclusion, Tolkien didn't avoid sexual assault, nor did he sanitize it or romanticize it. He wasn't about putting women in ivory towers and singing songs about them. He was real, hardcore real if you read the books. And putting opinions and our own personal experiences aside for a few seconds, We can also see that there is also a diversity of circumstances and reactions to assault and the perceived threat of assault in Tolkien stories. Some women are helpless to do anything to stop it in the threat of overwhelming power and invaders. Some women have the power to resist and do push back against it. Some women find ways or are just lucky enough to avoid a situation altogether when the threat is about to become real. Moreover, Tolkien deals with assaults in not just the physical sense, but also the mental and emotional sense as well. I didn't mention at the time, but you can even include what happened with Nienor and Glaurung when he essentially violates her mind and reduces her mind to the state of a child. That's a sense of violation. That is assault, though it's mental. And that's what makes these stories so tough to read and deal with, especially, I think, for modern fans who, again, see the Lord of the Rings movies, or who see the Lord of the Rings movies or go to Hobbiton in New Zealand, who think it's just about moral stories, big battles, and elves and little people. I would take this a step further to say that many fans, I think, just want simple tales of good and evil. Orcs versus elves, Uru versus Melkor, Gondor versus invaders, and so on. It's easy to avoid or quietly shunt aside that Tolkien addresses other aspects of life in Middle-earth and warfare in Middle-earth as well, and the complexities that can be included in that, such as with orcs, and you know damn well what I'm talking about. And just because he doesn't happen to say it in our modern language, or perhaps be as blunt about it as we would like him to be, does not mean he avoided the topic altogether of how women dealt with assault across the three ages of Middle-earth. And this is the reason, at least for me, why I consider Tolkien to be one of the best nuanced writers of fantasy to have ever lived. This is the Middle-earth Philosopher, and you guys have a good day.